title of today's message is, "'Tis the Season for Mithraism." If you turn to Hebrews 10, verse 4, we're going to get to that one eventually, in Hebrews 10, verse 4. If we look around, we see many religions in the world today. It's a world of religious confusion. Well-known religions are Christianity and Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, animism, Judaism, and Confucianism. Most of the world's religions fit into one of those general categories. So a person who's searching for spiritual understanding will come across some of these various belief systems. You could say there's an entire buffet of at the religious table. And it's hard for people to pick and choose what might be true and right, and compare that to the counterfeits that are offering all around the world these days. Well, Christianity, if we take a look in Wikipedia, it says Christianity has about 2.2 billion people, adherents, represents about a quarter to a third of the world's population, and is the world's largest religion. And it acknowledges there are many different denominations under the Christian umbrella, several main branches, and thousands, in fact, of denominations. Then we have the religion of Islam. Muslims regard their religion as the completed and universal version of the primordial monotheistic faith revealed at many times and places, notably to the prophets Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Well, the research went on to say it composes about 23% of the world's population in Islam, therefore making it the second largest religion in the world and arguably the fastest growing. The third largest religion is Hinduism. It's the predominant and indigenous tradition of South Asia. It's often referred to Hinduism as, and I'm going to try to pronounce this, but I don't speak Hindi or Sanskrit, Sanatana Dharma. A Sanskrit phrase means the eternal law by its adherents. It includes yogic traditions and a wide spectrum of daily morality based on the notion of karma. And I think some of us have heard karma used from time to time, like, well, you're going to get what's coming to you because it's going to come around. They call that karma. Demographically, then, Hinduism is the world's third largest religion after Christianity and Islam, about 1 billion adherents. And of those billion, about 830 million live in India. Now, it was some years ago, I accidentally saw a movie because it was in another teacher's classroom that I was watching, and it was about Hinduism in India. And I was surprised to find out, it's just amazing what you could find out when you follow somebody else's research, that it actually isn't really just one religion. It's a conglomeration of lots of local ideas and worships. In some parts of India, there's a belief system that's similar to what's next, and then the next one, and they all have their own versions of it, but they have they call it the same umbrella, calling it Hindu. Had a fellow who is not a Hindu but a Sikh staying on my family's home farm as a visiting, learning farm operations many years ago, which was interesting because that's one of the sects that never cut their hair, ever. So you can imagine how that wraps around and dressing in a certain way. And how that worked in a farm operation was rather interesting, I will say. And then you have the next religion is Buddhism. And it's also not just a religion, but a philosophy. And it has a variety of traditions and beliefs, but it's largely based on teachings that are attributed to a Siddhartha Gautama. It's commonly known, he's called Buddha. And they interpret that as the awakened one, has a higher sense of awareness of what's going on in the world. And this Buddha lived and taught in northeastern India between the 6th and 7th centuries BC. So roughly 500 BC, 500 years before Christ. Um, and so we have the estimate of the number of Buddhists in the world are between 230 and 500 million. And I'll tell you why in a moment, why that's such a range. Calling it the world's fourth largest religions, because some adhere to it as a religion and some just a general philosophy of way of life. So are they really religious about it, or is it just a philosophy that they follow? Shintoism, then, we'll take a look, is approximately the fifth largest religion. The indigenous religion of Japan and the Japanese people. And when we went to Japan and visited and took a tour of it, we visited many temples. Many of those are Shinto temples. Look just like a Buddhist temple, because you can be a Shinto and have the Buddhist philosophy. You can be both. And people are. And so it was really hard for me to tell, is this a Buddhist temple or is this a Shinto temple, if even the locals had to figure it out. Really a remarkable architecture, very interesting. It's described as a set of practices carried out to establish a connection between modern Japan and its ancient past. So there's a certain amount of ancestor worship that's involved in that. I remember the first time I went to Japan, it was 1985, and I was in a hotel, and right out of the hotel, there was a graveyard, cemetery with lots of upright stones. And I was surprised to find out that the graveyards, there were very few of them that were more than 100 years old, because they simply reinter people or put more ashes into the same one and carve more names on to it. But there is a lot of ancestor-related worship in that kind of religion. There's a lot of rituals, and there's neighborhood shrines. We saw that on their May Day celebrations, where they carry around a neighborhood shrine. Like this neighborhood would have a golden shrine of some sort, like a litter, maybe described in the Bible in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, about a couple of shafts, and you're holding a pallet of some kind, and decorations and all kinds of fancy things on it. And each neighborhood apparently has its own, and then they parade them on certain days of the year. The encyclopedias refer to Judaism then as one of the oldest religions of the world. Of course, we know that God was involved from the creation of humanity, and Judah was the son of Jacob, who was then the grandson of Isaac and the great-grandson of Abraham, who wasn't even born. Judah wasn't even born until 1566 BC, about 25 years after we calculate Adam and Eve. And so it's difficult to say that Judaism pre-existed. How about just God's religion existed since creation? But there's only about 13 million or so, and about less than half of those are in Israel, about 40% in the United States, and about 20% scattered around the rest of the world. So it's certainly not a very large religion on the world standards. There's also a religion called animism. It's from the Latin meaning anima, or soul, and combined, and life. And it's a philosophical or religious or spiritual idea that souls or spirits don't just exist in humans, but also in animals, plants, rocks, natural phenomena such as thunder, geographic features like mountains or rivers in the environment. And animism would include then the religion of Native Americans and many native peoples of Africa and the Australian Aborigines and others. And of course, we don't think of animists, people don't say, well, hello, I'm an animist. But nowadays, the New Age movement is really a presentation of the ancient animist type belief. And you have, growing from that, you have the modern, what they call neo-pagans or eco-pagans, where they worship the creation instead of the creator, because they think a little bit of God is in a little bit of everything. And from those, of course, come the Wiccans. Now, the Wiccans, we refer to them as often as witches, and they refer to the idea of a mother god or a mother goddess or a horned god, and so forth. Other religions you may have heard of include Confucianism. That's a Chinese ethical and philosophical system developed from the teachings of a Chinese philosopher named Confucius, somewhere around 500 BC. It's a complex system of moral, social, political, and philosophical and quasi-religious thought that has tremendous influence on culture and history of East Asia. And some will argue that Confucianism isn't really religion, it's more of a philosophy. But as a practical matter, it fulfills the same function as a religion. There's about 1.4 billion people in China, and I don't know how many people, are followers of Confucianism, but it even affects us in our society today. And you can think of common sayings such as, a long journey begins with the first step, is attributed to a Confucius saying, or Confucius says, and they have all these, he who hesitates is lost, which was particularly true at the dinner table when I was growing up among one of four boys. You'd best get yourself in there, although the parents didn't teach that Confucianism then. So those are our choices in the world. We've got mainstream Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism, animism, Judaism, and Confucianism. And that's the choices today. And this isn't all of them, but that's the bulk of them. Now let's consider what were the choices, the religious choices in the land of Israel at the time that Jesus Christ walked the streets of Jerusalem. Because the big religions of today were not the big religions around the world at the time of Jesus' birth and during the time of the early apostles when they were taking the message of the gospel of the kingdom of God, of early Christianity, to the world. So other than Judaism, the three dominant religions at the time in the Mediterranean region were the cult of Isis, I-S-I-S. And this cult originated in Egypt, and they had an older Egyptian version, and Isis was regarded as the goddess of heaven, earth, and sea, and the unseen world below. In this earlier stage, Isis had a husband named Osiris. The cult of Isis became a mystery religion after Ptolemy from Greece introduced changes around 300 BC, and these changes were introduced to synthesize Egyptian cult of Isis with the Greek kingdoms. And eventually then it made its way to Rome. And while Rome at first resisted the cult of Isis, the religion finally entered the city during the reign of Caligula, which was just after the death of Christ, around 37 to 41 AD. The cult of Isis spread gradually over the next 200 years, and in some areas became the major rival for growing Christianity. And the cult of Isis offered rituals and the hope of immortality to its followers. Another main religion was the cult of Cybele. Now, you thought that the transgender stuff was new? Oh no. We go back here to the cult of Cybele, where their transgendered priestess was called the cult of the Great Mother at that time. And we don't have a lot of writing about it because they wanted to hide what they were, and only the inner, their secrets were kept to the initiates, or the people that became involved in it only. And so you have to get the information from them, from outside sources of people that bumped into it. So Cybele was actually originated or called as an earth goddess, worshipped in Asia Minor. We call that Turkey. And as the Earth Mother, it said the word Cybele may have been derived from the local word for cube, meaning a chunk, and may refer to a black meteorite that was associated with her. Also shown seated on a throne flanked by leopards. So these are very different types of religions of what we have around us today, right? This particular religion was primarily associated with concerns of women, protection against enemies, healing of illnesses, guardians of the dead, and the giver of the gift of prophecy. The Greeks colonized Asia Minor, we call it Turkey, after the Trojan War, and then they discovered that this cult of Sybil was everywhere in Asia Minor. Of course, that's where Paul was traveling at the time he went on his missionary journeys. And the cult of Sybil was around since around 700 BC. And finally, we get to one of these cults called the cult of Mithras. And each of the cults that we look at, they call them mystery religions. They had significant number of people that followed them. And it was their early backdrop. This is the world that early Christians were being called out of at that time. And so this is what Jesus Christ was, the world that he was looking at, and the world, and what the early disciples and apostles were during the 1st and 2nd century, and principally the cult of Mithras. And so I want to look at Mithraism, and we can notice there are certain types of symbols were used as counterfeits to draw people away from knowledge of the truth of God and away from the understanding of the gospel message preached by Jesus Christ. Now, some of you may have heard of the author Rudyard Kipling, a famous British author, wrote about Mithraism. In fact, he wrote it this way. Mithras, god of the morning, our trumpets waken the wall. Rome is above the nations, but thou art over all. A song to Mithras by Rudyard Kipling. Now, I find it's interesting that he says, well, Rome was in charge of Europe and the Mediterranean, and that the cult of Mithras, this religion, was over Rome. So, and he calls him a god of the morning. I want to turn to Revelation 22 and verse 16 to see who the real god of the morning is. In Revelation 22, verse 16. Because sometimes these belief systems try to rob from the knowledge of Jesus Christ and take it to themselves. In Revelation 22, verse 16, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, the bright and morning star. And you notice here that Christ referred to himself as the morning star. And yet, there are verses in the Bible that Lucifer, or Satan, is also referred to as a morning star. If we take a look in Isaiah 14:12, how have you fallen from heaven, O morning star, son of the dawn? You've been cast to the earth, you who were once laid low by the nations. That's the NIV version. In the King James and the New King James, they translate morning star as Lucifer, son of the morning. So in this case, we would say morning star refers then to Satan. And yet we just read that Jesus Christ referred to himself as the morning star. Well, how can they both be then a morning star? It's interesting to note the concept of morning star is not the only concept to apply to both Jesus Christ and Satan. In Revelation 5:5, Jesus is referred to as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. In 1 Peter 5:8, Satan is compared to a lion, seeking someone to be devoured. The point is that Jesus and Satan, to an extent, have similarities to lions, but Jesus is similar to a lion in that he is the king. He is royal and majestic, but Satan is similar to a lion and he seeks to devour other creatures. And that's where the similarities between Jesus and Satan and the lion's end. However, Jesus and Satan are like lions because they're like lions in different ways. So now let's go to this idea of a bright morning star. Well, if we take a look at Jesus is the one who's called bright. Satan was just called a morning star. So there's a description on Jesus Christ as being the bright and morning star. Jesus is also called the holy and most powerful light in the universe. So while Jesus and Satan both can be described as morning stars, there is not equating them, because Satan is a created being. His light only exists to the extent that God allows it or who originally created it. Because Jesus, if we take a look in John 9 and verse 5, Jesus is the light of the world. Only Jesus, the light, is bright and self-existent. So we say Satan may be the morning star, but he's only a poor imitation of the true and the bright and the morning star, Jesus Christ. So we have Satan attempts to be an imitation. And we have that with these other religions who try to imitate that which that is in true Christianity. If we turn to 2 Peter in 1, verses 18 and 19. In 2 Peter 1, verses 18 and 19. And we heard this voice which came from heaven, which we were all with him, meaning Christ, on the holy mountain. And so we have the prophetic word confirmed, which you do well to heed, as a light that shines in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. This, the Apostle Peter was explaining about the importance of having the bright and morning star, the one that shines in a dark place, in your heart. Well, let's get back then to the story of Mithras, the one of the religions that Satan has tried to palm off on society at the time of Christ and the apostles. Mithras was called, this is according to History of Pagan Europe, a book in 1995 by Jones and Pennick. Mithras is a soldier's god who was worshipped in Rome for more than 300 years. There is very little written record and little evidence of what their actual worship consists of. We do have some. But the tradition identifies Mithras with a Persian god who belonged to the pantheon ruled over by a great god and named Ahura Mazda. So one of a number of gods. And this god then one god would fight other ones for the souls of humanity and the fate of the world. Well, the Mithras' job was to be the judger of souls. So here we are having a pagan god attempting to usurp God and Jesus Christ. The Persian tradition said that Mithras was born of an immaculate virgin called the Mother of God, conceived from the seed of Zoroaster, and now there is a religion now in Iran called Zoroastrianism, which predates Islam. Had an Iranian student one time, and I had foolishly asked students if they could, that I gave them 5 minutes to ask any question that they wanted. I do this once in a while. This was some years ago. And an Iranian student said, "What is the original religion of Iran?" And I said, "Well, that would be Zoroastrianism." And he stood there with his mouth open. I don't suppose that too many people are aware of that, but because he thought I would fall into the Islam, but he was not. So this Mithras is called the light of the world. He's worshipped as the mediator between heaven and earth. He was born in midwinter and remained a celibate. He, striding forth into the coldness of the world, according to this book, he killed the sacred bull and offered the blood of sacrifices to his followers. Sound somewhat similar to what Christianity, they're trying to usurp Christianity. In their ritual, they drank wine that was said to have turned into blood and ate the bread of the sacrifice after an initiation ceremony that consisted of a ritual baptism. Now, I heard about this baptism from one of my college graduate school professors a number of years ago on the history of education, and somehow he slipped into this part, and he was explaining, you see, now the Mithraeans, they worship on Sunday, and they celebrate the birth of Mithras on December 25th. You may have heard of that as a birthday. But what they do is to become part of that, they had to be baptized in blood. So they would have a grate, and they would take a bull and lead it up to the grate, and then the soldiers that wanted to join this, they would slice the jugular vein of the bull, and it would spray the blood out upon the followers, and then they would be initiated into that particular religion. And yet this was the dominant religion of the day when the Apostle Paul was preaching in his journeys, or at the time of Christ as well. Mithras was supposed to, according to the history that has been derived from this, that he finished the work that he was set out to do, ate a supper, and then ascended to heaven to watch over his followers until the day of judgment, and then the good and the evil would be separated. Of course, this resemblance to Christianity is remarkable, that Mithraism arose about the same time in the Roman world as Christianity. And early Christian historians noted the resemblance and commented on it. That, now nobody says that Mithraism was the inspiration for Christianity. Well, I'm sure there are some people that want to say that somewhere, because Christianity is so well documented. In the early years, when the apostles were traveling, the cult was very much a soldier's cult, because it had the sacrifice of an ox and the bloodbath that would bring strength and loyalty, or so it was said. The Catholic Encyclopedia says that Mithraism is a Roman mystery religion that flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, meaning the first couple hundred years following the birth of Christ, and involved the worship of the ancient Persian god Mithras. Had a communal meal and initiation through 7 stages of a hierarchical initiation phrase. Well, so if you take a look, Mithraism, it had baptism. It has a type of Passover, or drinking of wine and bread. It says that this Mithraean god would look out for you, have a type of love for you. It required you to have a penance, and it had anointings. And its chapels resembled little churches, so you'd have them from place to place. And so they would bond together. So this was the kind of world then that an early Christian would have to come out of, because that was an influence in that time. And we find that Mithraism resisted Christianity more than other cults. And so it tried to destroy Christianity, and so it was a direct affront to Christianity. Now, of course, when we take a look at Hebrews 10, and we looked at in the verse that I first pointed out, in Hebrews 10, verse 4, it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sins. Well, this blood and goats taking away sins, of course, was early sacrifices. It wasn't just the sacrifices that were doing it. They were speaking not just of one group of rituals, but many different groups of rituals that would try to mock Christianity and baptize people in blood. That wasn't going to do it. If we read in Hebrews 10:10, what brings sanctification? By which we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ for once and for all. So Christianity is supremely different from all of these other religions, because there was the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Hebrews 10, verse 14, by one offering he has perfected forever them that are sanctified. And verse 16, this is the covenant that I will make with them after these days, says the Lord. I will put my laws into their heart and into their minds, and I will write them. And their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. So we have we have a Jesus Christ who sacrificed himself for us, and which was very different than the sacrifices that were being offered by these other religions. So true Christianity is a choice, and God called us to do his work, and we must be careful to make those right choices. I was pleased to hear the sermonette today, but in making those choices, we have to avoid what we call syncretism or counterfeit doctrines. This is where religions try to put a counterfeit doctrine that sort of kind of almost matches what Christianity has for doctrines, and tries to usurp it or take it over. If we go back to 1 Kings in chapter 18, in 1 Kings chapter 18, and this story is where Elijah was confronting King Ahab in the northern country of Israel, and it was after a drought period, And after this drought period, Ahab and Elijah had a confrontation. And and Elijah said, call your to Ahab, call your prophets of Baal and have them offer a sacrifice. And this was during a drought period. And they offered their sacrifices, or brought up a sacrifice, and they said, have your priests call on God, your God, Baal, to come down and light the fire for the sacrifice. And they wailed and moaned and cut themselves, and it didn't happen. And then Elijah came. If we read in 1 Kings 18, Elijah offered his sacrifice, put it on the altar, and then brought water, which was extremely scarce, and poured it over the altar, and then asked God to light the fire. And God sent down the fire, consumed the sacrifice, dried up all the water, was shocking to the people. And then we read in 1 Kings 18, verse 21, because a lot of people were there to watch this. They gathered around to see this event. And Elijah came to all the people and said, how long do you halt between two opinions? But if the Lord, meaning God, then follow him. But if Baal is God, well, then follow him. And the people answered not a word. What could they say? They had been Baal worshipers, and they saw the very difference between the two. Well, if we have our God as a true God, and he is, and then what's the consequence for deciding to follow God? You may have heard of this verse earlier today in Deuteronomy 30, verse 19. In Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your seed may live. Well, we are at that time of year where we have false religion all around us. And we can see it on the decorations. We can see it in cultures around the world. Even religions that don't have a Christmas in their culture, they adopt some of the accoutrements of Christmas in order to fit along with the culture that we have. And so I find it remarkable that things, although they change, they really stay the same, where people are trying to put together. Now, a year ago, I gave a presentation on the introduction to the Christmas season, and you can find that on ucg.org or on our YouTube channel by searching UCG space NWA, Introduction to the Christmas Season. And this is a front row seat that we have for the differences between a variety of the world's religion and true Christianity. Now, we have some people that say, well, I don't have a religion. I'm a humanist. I'm a secular humanist. Well, I suppose I should break it to them that secular humanism, it purports to disdain religion, but it really becomes a religious worship in and of itself. It has the belief systems, it has its high priests, it has its special writings. It becomes a religious system, even though they claim that it is not. And so for every season we have around the calendar, there seems to be a religion for all of these different seasons. But we have a choice. We can follow the religions that lead to death, or we can follow God's teachings that lead to eternal life. So let's choose life by following God.